He hadn't spoken to anyone in years, until a cat came through the window. The latch gave way with a sharp crack, and a cat crossed through the window like someone invading a destiny, not just a room. Ezra Calloway, the man who hadn't spoken to anyone in years, froze with his cup of cold coffee halfway to his lips. The air in his old house on a side street in Bangor, Maine, carried the scent of dust, electric heating, and yesterday's newspaper. The intruder landed on the windowsill, narrowed eyes of a green that cut through the dim light and stayed. There was no hurry, no fear, just presence. The house, which had been a silent mausoleum for so long, suddenly breathed. Ezra stared at the cat, a sleek tabby with distinctive markings that looked like brushstrokes across its fur. For 3 years, since Margaret's funeral, nothing had crossed that threshold uninvited. The mailman left packages on the porch. The grocery delivery boy rang once and departed. Even the Jehovah's Witnesses had given up after months of silence from behind the heavy oak door. But this cat had simply decided the window was meant to be open. "Shoo," Ezra whispered, his voice crackling like old paper. The sound startled him more than it did the cat, who merely blinked slowly, as if acknowledging the attempt at communication without taking it seriously. The coffee in Ezra's mug had long gone cold, a film forming on its surface like ice on a forgotten pond. He set it down on the kitchen table where he'd been sitting for the past hour, doing what he did every morning, nothing. The crossword puzzle lay half-finished, pen marks scattered across the grid like false starts at conversation. Outside, Bangor moved through its October rhythm. School buses groaned to life. Coffee shop doors chimed open. The Methodist church across the street prepared for its weekly community breakfast, the smell of bacon and pancakes drifting through windows that most people kept open to welcome the crisp fall air. Ezra's windows had been closed for years, until now. The cat stretched, arching its back in a perfect curve, then settled into a more comfortable position on the sill. It began to groom itself with the kind of unhurried confidence that suggested it had every right to be there. "This isn't your home," Ezra said, louder this time. His voice echoed strangely in the kitchen, bouncing off walls that had absorbed nothing but silence for so long they seemed to have forgotten how to handle sound. The cat paused in its grooming and looked directly at him. Those green eyes held something that made Ezra's chest tighten, not judgment, not pity, but simple acknowledgement. The kind of look Margaret used to give him when she knew he was hurting but didn't want to talk about it yet. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the linoleum floor. The cat didn't flinch. Instead, it tilted its head, as if curious about what this strange, bearded man in yesterday's clothes might do next. What Ezra did was nothing. He stood there, coffee-stained sweater hanging loose on his shrinking frame, and stared at this creature that had somehow breached the fortress he'd spent 3 years building around his grief. The house settled around them with the kind of creaks and sighs that old buildings make when the weather turns cold. The furnace kicked on with a mechanical wheeze, pushing warm air through vents that hadn't seen proper cleaning since before Margaret got sick. Dust motes danced in the shaft of afternoon light, streaming through the newly opened window, creating patterns that reminded Ezra, painfully, of the way his wife used to move through their kitchen while cooking. Graceful, purposeful, alive. The cat seemed to understand it was witnessing something significant. It stopped grooming entirely and simply watched as Ezra's carefully constructed walls began to show their first hairline cracks. "You can't stay," he said finally, but the words lacked conviction. They were the kind of protest someone makes when they know they're already losing an argument with themselves. As if in response, the cat hopped down from the windowsill and walked across the kitchen floor with deliberate steps. It stopped directly in front of Ezra's feet and sat down, wrapping its tail around its paws in a gesture that somehow managed to be both polite and defiant. Then it began to purr. The sound filled the kitchen like a small engine, rhythmic and warm. Ezra felt it in his chest, a vibration that seemed to loosen something that had been wound too tight for too long. His knees buckled slightly, and he gripped the edge of the table for support. When was the last time anything in this house had made a sound that wasn't mechanical or hollow? When was the last time something had chosen to be here, rather than simply existing here because it had nowhere else to go? The cat's purring continued, steady as a heartbeat, patient as prayer. Outside, the afternoon light began to shift toward evening, casting longer shadows across the kitchen floor. The community breakfast at the Methodist church would be wrapping up soon. Neighbors would be heading home with full bellies and renewed connections, ready to face another week of small kindnesses and shared burdens. Ezra had forgotten what that felt like. The cat stood and walked to the refrigerator, where it sat down again and looked expectantly at the door. The message was clear. If you're going to let me stay, at least temporarily, we should discuss dinner arrangements. Despite everything, the grief, the isolation, the carefully maintained distance from the world, Ezra almost smiled. Almost. Instead, he opened the refrigerator and found the package of sliced turkey he'd bought 3 days ago and barely touched. He tore off a small piece and placed it on the floor. The cat approached the offering with dignity, sniffed it once and began to eat with delicate precision. "This doesn't mean anything," Ezra said aloud, but his voice had lost its earlier edge. "You're just passing through." The cat finished the turkey and looked up at him with those impossibly green eyes. In them, Ezra saw something he hadn't seen in his own mirror for 3 years, the possibility that tomorrow might be different from today. As darkness settled over Bangor and the streetlights flickered on one by one, the cat made its way back to the windowsill. It settled down in the same spot where it had first appeared, tucking its paws beneath its body and closing its eyes halfway, the classic cat position that suggested sleep without vulnerability. Ezra watched from the kitchen table, his cold coffee long forgotten. For the first time in 3 years, he wasn't dreading the night ahead. He wasn't exactly looking forward to it either, but something had shifted in the space between dread and anticipation. Something had changed, and as he sat there in the gathering darkness, with only the soft sound of breathing from the windowsill to keep him company, Ezra began to wonder what would happen if the cat decided to come back tomorrow. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it made him feel something he'd almost forgotten existed, curiosity about what came next. The cat returned at exactly 7 o'clock the next morning, appearing at the window like punctuality itself had taken feline form. Ezra had been awake for hours, sitting in the same kitchen chair, telling himself he wasn't waiting for anything in particular. But when the familiar silhouette appeared on the windowsill, his heart performed a small skip that he pretended not to notice. This time, the cat didn't wait for an invitation. It pushed through the already open window with the confidence of someone returning home from a brief errand. The morning air that followed carried the scent of maple leaves and wood smoke from someone's fireplace, the smell of October in Maine that Ezra had forgotten he loved. The cat walked directly to the spot where the turkey had been placed the night before and sat down expectantly. "So this is how it's going to be," Ezra muttered, but he was already moving toward the refrigerator. He found himself looking forward to this small ritual, this moment of purpose, in what had become an endless string of purposeless days. As he placed another piece of turkey on the floor, the cat looked up at him with what could only be described as approval. Then it began to eat, tail twitching with satisfaction. "You need a name if you're going to keep showing up," Ezra said, surprising himself with the admission that this might be more than a one-time occurrence. The cat paused in its eating to consider this, as if names were serious business that required proper deliberation. "Sable," Ezra said suddenly, the word appearing in his mind like a memory surfacing from deep water. "You look like sable fur." At the sound of its new name, the cat, Sable, looked up and made a small chirping sound that was neither quite a meow nor a purr, but something in between. It was the sound of acknowledgement, of a contract being signed in whatever language exists between species who choose each other. Over the following days, a routine emerged. Sable would arrive at 7 sharp, spend an hour exploring the kitchen and living room, accept an offering of turkey or chicken, and then settle on the windowsill to observe the street outside. Around 10, he would depart as suddenly as he'd arrived, returning to whatever mysterious life he led outside Ezra's increasingly less solitary world. But on the 4th day, something changed. Ezra woke to the sound of scratching at the window frame, not frantic but insistent, like someone knocking on a door with all the patience in the world. Sable sat on the sill, one paw raised against the glass, green eyes fixed on Ezra with unmistakable intent. "It's not 7 yet," Ezra said, checking the clock on the microwave. 6:15. The cat had arrived 45 minutes early. Sable continued his patient scratching, each tap against the glass like a gentle reminder that schedules were meant to be flexible, that sometimes the heart had its own timetable. Ezra opened the window wider, and Sable immediately leaped down and began his usual circuit of the kitchen. But instead of stopping at his feeding spot, he walked straight to the living room, a space Ezra hadn't properly entered in months. The living room was where Margaret had spent her final weeks, where the hospital bed had been positioned to catch the afternoon light she loved. Ezra had closed the door after the funeral and never opened it again, taking his meals at the kitchen table and falling asleep in the old recliner that now lived permanently in the corner. But Sable had no respect for emotional barriers. He pushed against the living room door with his shoulder until it swung open, then walked inside as if he belonged there. Ezra followed reluctantly, his bare feet silent on the hardwood floor that hadn't felt footsteps in 3 years. The room looked exactly as he'd left it. Furniture covered with sheets, curtains drawn tight, air thick with the weight of memories he wasn't ready to face. Sable jumped onto the covered sofa and began kneading the sheet with his paws, purring with the kind of deep satisfaction that suggested he'd found exactly what he was looking for. "Get down," Ezra said weakly. "That's not... You can't just..." But Sable had already settled into the perfect circle that cats somehow always manage to form, and his purring had taken on the quality of an engine warming up for a long journey. For a moment, Ezra stood frozen in the doorway, caught between the desire to flee back to his kitchen fortress and something else, a pull he couldn't name, toward the life that had once filled this room with laughter and conversation, and the comfortable silences that come with decades of shared love. He took one step forward, then another. The floorboard near the window creaked the way it always had, the sound so familiar it made his chest ache. But he kept walking until he reached the other end of the sofa, where he carefully pulled away the sheet to reveal the burgundy fabric underneath. Sable opened one eye and regarded this progress with what looked suspiciously like satisfaction. "This doesn't mean I'm ready," Ezra told him. "This doesn't mean anything's changed." But even as he said it, he was reaching over to scratch behind Sable's ears, marveling at the softness of the fur and the way the cat immediately leaned into his touch, purring louder. They sat like that as the morning light gradually filtered through the heavy curtains, creating patterns on the floor that reminded Ezra of the way Margaret used to arrange her quilting squares, seemingly random but somehow perfect in their imperfection. Around 8 o'clock, there was a gentle knock at the front door. Ezra froze. No one knocked on his door, ever. The mailman had long since learned to leave packages on the porch. The grocery delivery service had specific instructions to ring once and depart. Even the most persistent salespeople had given up after months of unanswered knocks. But the knocking continued, patient and friendly, followed by a woman's voice. "Mr. Calloway, I hope I'm not disturbing you. I'm Meredith Ainsley from next door." Ezra knew the name, though he'd never spoken to its owner. The widow who lived in the blue house with the perfect garden, who always waved when she saw him through the window, who left Christmas cookies on his porch each December with notes he never answered. "I noticed you have a visitor," Meredith continued, her voice carrying through the door with the kind of practiced kindness that came from years of knowing exactly how to approach wounded creatures without frightening them further. "A tabby cat? I wanted to let you know I've been feeding him for about a week now. I wasn't sure if he belonged to anyone." Sable lifted his head from his paws and looked toward the door with interest, as if he recognized the voice of another benefactor. Ezra's mouth felt dry. He should answer. He should open the door and have a normal conversation with a neighbor about a cat that apparently belonged to both of them and neither of them. He should behave like a functioning member of the human community. Instead, he sat frozen on his own sofa, one hand still resting on Sable's warm fur, unable to form words that would bridge the gap between his self-imposed exile and the normal world that continued to exist just beyond his door. "I have some cat food," Meredith said gently, "and a carrier if you need to take him to a vet. I'll leave everything on the porch, no pressure at all. I just thought, well, it seems like he's chosen you." Footsteps retreated down the front walk, followed by the soft sound of items being placed on the wooden boards outside his door. Ezra looked down at Sable, who was now purring so loudly he seemed to be vibrating the entire sofa. "Chosen me," Ezra repeated softly. "Is that what this is?" Sable stretched one paw forward and placed it deliberately on Ezra's knee, claws just barely extended, in a gesture that was possessive without being demanding. Outside, the morning was fully underway. School buses had finished their routes. The coffee shops were settling into their late morning rhythm. The Methodist Church was probably preparing for whatever Wednesday activities brought people together in the name of community and shared purpose. And inside this house that had been a tomb for 3 years, a man and a cat sat together on a burgundy sofa, listening to the sound of life continuing all around them. It wasn't much. It wasn't a miracle, but it was the first crack in a wall that had seemed impenetrable, and both of them could feel something new trying to push through toward the light. The bag of cat food sat on Ezra's porch for 2 days before he finally brought it inside. Every time he opened the front door to collect his mail, there it was, a bright blue bag with a smiling tabby on the front, positioned next to a note weighted down with a small stone. "For your friend," the note read in careful handwriting. "The pet store says this brand is good for strays who need to gain weight." Meredith Sable had indeed gotten thinner over the past week, despite Ezra's offerings of deli meat and the occasional scrambled egg. His ribs were becoming more prominent beneath his fur, and his energy seemed to flag by mid-morning, though he still maintained his punctual schedule of arrivals and departures. On the third day, when Sable arrived looking particularly gaunt, Ezra finally surrendered to the inevitable. He brought in the cat food, along with the small ceramic bowls Meredith had thoughtfully included, and read the feeding instructions with the same careful attention he'd once given to Margaret's medication schedules. The sound of dry kibble hitting ceramic was apparently the most beautiful music Sable had ever heard. He materialized at Ezra's feet before the bowl was fully filled, purring with an intensity that bordered on theatrical. "Greedy," Ezra muttered, but there was affection in his voice that surprised him. When was the last time he'd spoken to anything with warmth instead of mere resignation? As Sable ate with single-minded focus, Ezra found himself studying the note from Meredith. The handwriting was elegant but unpretentious, the kind of script that suggested someone who still wrote thank-you letters and birthday cards by hand. At the bottom, she'd added her phone number and a simple message: "Call if you need anything at all." That afternoon, while Sable napped on the windowsill, Ezra did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He looked up a phone number and dialed it. "Meredith, this is Ezra from next door." His voice cracked on the introduction, unused to identifying himself to another human being. "Oh, hello." Her voice carried genuine warmth, not the forced cheerfulness that had become so familiar from well-meaning acquaintances after Margaret's death. "How is your little friend doing?" "Better. The food helped. I wanted to—" Ezra paused, the simple act of expressing gratitude feeling like a foreign language. "Thank you. For the food. And the bowls. You didn't have to do that." "Of course I did. We cat people have to stick together." There was a smile in her voice. "Has he let you name him yet?" "Sable." "That's perfect. He looks exactly like sable fur." Meredith paused, then added gently, "I've been wondering if he might need to see a vet, just to make sure he's healthy. There's a good one on Hammond Street, Dr. Peterson. She's wonderful with strays." The word stray hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went beyond simple pet ownership. Ezra looked at Sable, who was beginning to stir from his afternoon nap, stretching each paw with deliberate precision. "I don't know," Ezra said slowly. "I'm not sure he's really mine." "Oh, honey," Meredith said with the kind of gentle certainty that came from years of experience with reluctant hearts. "He's absolutely yours. The question is whether you're ready to be his." After hanging up, Ezra sat at his kitchen table with the phone number for Dr. Peterson's veterinary clinic written on the back of Meredith's note. Making an appointment would be an admission of something he wasn't sure he was prepared to acknowledge, that he was responsible for another living creature, that he had something to lose again. But Sable had developed a slight wheeze that became more noticeable in the evenings, and his appetite, while enthusiastic, seemed to tire him more than it should. The call to the vet's office was easier than expected. The receptionist was kind but businesslike, offering an appointment slot for the following Tuesday at 2 o'clock. "First-time patient?" she asked. "We'll need to do a full exam, update vaccinations if needed, test for parasites. Probably around $200 depending on what we find." $200. Ezra looked around his kitchen, taking inventory of what he might need to sacrifice for Sable's health. The coffee maker that brewed 1 cup at a time but cost twice as much as a regular pot. The premium cable package he never watched. The weekly grocery delivery that kept him from having to face other people at the store. It should have felt overwhelming, this sudden insertion of responsibility into his carefully managed isolation. Instead, it felt like the first purposeful decision he'd made in 3 years. The day of the appointment arrived grey and drizzling, typical November weather that made everything feel muted and tentative. Sable had seemed to sense that something unusual was happening. He'd arrived earlier than usual and spent the morning pacing between the kitchen and living room with uncharacteristic restlessness. Getting him into the carrier Meredith had provided proved to be a diplomatic challenge. Sable was willing to explore the plastic cave when the door was open, but the moment Ezra began to close it, he transformed into a creature of pure liquid resistance, somehow managing to be everywhere and nowhere at once. "Come on," Ezra pleaded. sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. "This is for your own good." Sable fixed him with a look that clearly communicated his opinion of activities that were allegedly for his own good. It was only when Ezra sat down on the floor next to the carrier and began talking, really talking, not just issuing commands, that Sable finally settled. "I'm scared too," Ezra admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I haven't been anywhere in 3 years. I haven't talked to anyone except Meredith, and that was just once. What if they ask me questions I don't know how to answer? What if something's really wrong with you and I don't have enough money to fix it? What if—" Sable walked calmly into the carrier and sat down, looking at Ezra through the mesh door with infinite patience. "What if I'm not good enough to take care of you?" Ezra finished. In response, Sable began to purr, not the loud, demanding purr of mealtime, but the soft, rhythmic purr of contentment and trust. The drive to Dr. Peterson's office was Ezra's first time behind the wheel in months. His hands shook on the steering wheel, and he had to pull over twice to steady his breathing. But Sable's presence in the passenger seat, occasionally making small chirping sounds from inside his carrier, somehow made the journey manageable. The veterinary clinic bustled with the controlled chaos of a place where healing happened daily. Dogs barked from examination rooms, cats yowled their displeasure at being away from home, and through it all, staff members moved with the efficient kindness of people who had chosen to dedicate their lives to the welfare of creatures who couldn't speak for themselves. Dr. Peterson was a woman in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of steady hands that immediately inspired confidence. She approached Sable's carrier with the unhurried grace of someone who understood that trust was earned, not demanded. "And who do we have here?" she asked, opening the carrier door and allowing Sable to emerge at his own pace. "Sable," Ezra said. "He's been visiting me for about a month now." Dr. Peterson's examination was thorough but gentle. She listened to Sable's heart and lungs, checked his eyes and ears, felt along his spine and abdomen with practiced fingers. Throughout it all, she kept up a steady stream of conversation directed at both patient and owner. "He's definitely undernourished, but not dangerously so. The wheeze you mentioned is probably just a mild upper respiratory infection, common in cats who've been living rough. Some antibiotics should clear that right up." She looked up at Ezra with kind eyes. "He's lucky you found each other." The final bill came to exactly $212. As Ezra wrote the check, his hand steady for the first time all day, he realized something had fundamentally shifted. He was no longer a man who happened to have a cat visiting him. He was a cat owner, with all the responsibilities and vulnerabilities that came with the title. On the drive home, Sable sat quietly in his carrier, occasionally pressing his nose against the mesh to look out at the passing world. When they pulled into Ezra's driveway, he could see Meredith working in her front yard, raking leaves into neat piles that would probably be scattered again by the next day's wind. She looked up as Ezra carried the carrier toward his house, and their eyes met across the small distance that separated their properties. She didn't wave or call out, just smiled and gave a small nod that somehow conveyed everything: pride, encouragement, and the quiet acknowledgement that some journeys are taken one small step at a time. That evening, as Sable explored his newly medicated and officially claimed territory, Ezra sat in the living room, not the kitchen but the living room, and called Meredith to report on the vet visit. "Dr. Peterson says he'll be fine," he told her. "Just needs antibiotics and regular meals." "I'm so glad," Meredith said. "You did the right thing." After hanging up, Ezra realized that for the first time in 3 years, he had done something that mattered to someone other than himself. It was a small thing, taking a sick cat to the vet, but it felt like the first step on a path he'd forgotten existed. Outside, November wind rattled the windows, but inside, a cat named Sable purred himself to sleep on a burgundy sofa, and a man who had forgotten how to care began to remember what it felt like to have something worth protecting. December arrived in Maine the way it always did, suddenly and with purpose. The first real snowstorm hit on a Tuesday, turning Ezra's quiet street into a tunnel of white that muffled sound and transformed familiar landmarks into mysterious shapes. By Wednesday morning, the power was out. Ezra woke to a house so cold, his breath formed small clouds in the gray light filtering through frost-covered windows. The electric heat hadn't kicked on at its usual 5 a.m. cycle, and the digital clocks throughout the house stared back at him with blank faces, but it was the silence that worried him most. No gentle purring from the windowsill, no soft footsteps padding across the kitchen floor. Sable was gone. "Sable?" Ezra called, his voice hoarse in the frigid air. He pulled on yesterday's clothes and searched every room, looking under furniture and behind curtains, checking all the places a cat might hide from the cold. Nothing. The window in the kitchen, Sable's preferred entrance and exit, was sealed shut by a coating of ice, and snow had drifted against the glass in patterns that suggested the storm had been raging for hours. When had Sable left? Had he been trying to get back in when the ice formed? Panic rose in Ezra's chest like cold water. In the 3 months since Sable had first appeared, Ezra had grown accustomed to his presence in a way that went deeper than routine. The cat had become the rhythm by which his days were measured, the living proof that his house was more than just a place where someone waited to die. Now Sable was out there somewhere in weather that could kill, and Ezra was responsible. He pulled on his heaviest coat, a wool pea coat that still smelled faintly of Margaret's perfume from the last time they'd walked together, and stepped outside into a world transformed by the storm. The snow was knee-deep and still falling, driven by wind that cut through his clothes like ice water. "Sable!" he called, his voice immediately swallowed by the storm. He trudged through his front yard, then along the sidewalk that was no longer visible beneath the snow, calling a name that the wind scattered before it could reach any ears that might be listening. His neighbors' houses looked abandoned in the storm, windows dark, driveways impassable. But as he reached the end of the block, he saw a flicker of light from Meredith's kitchen window, the warm glow of what had to be candles or a battery-powered lantern. Without allowing himself to think about what he was doing, Ezra turned up Meredith's front walk and knocked on her door. She answered almost immediately, as if she'd been watching for signs of life in the neighborhood. Her face was illuminated by the soft light of several candles behind her, and she was wrapped in a thick robe that made her look smaller and older than he'd imagined. "Ezra, come in, come in. You must be freezing." She stepped back to let him enter, and he found himself in a kitchen that glowed with warmth despite the obvious lack of electricity. A small camping stove sat on the counter next to a kettle, and several cats, he counted at least 4, were curled up on various chairs and surfaces, watching his entrance with mild interest. "I'm sorry to bother you," he began, then stopped. "How did you explain to someone that you'd lost track of the one thing that had given your life meaning? How did you admit that you'd been so careless with something precious?" "It's Sable, isn't it?" Meredith said gently. "I was wondering if the storm might have caught him outside." Ezra nodded, not trusting his voice. "When did you last see him?" "Yesterday evening, around 6. He always comes back in the morning, but with the power out and the window iced over." Ezra trailed off, the implications too frightening to voice. Meredith was already moving, pulling on boots and a heavy coat. "He's probably found shelter somewhere. Cats are remarkably good at surviving, but we should look for him. Do you have a flashlight?" They spent the next hour trudging through the storm, calling Sable's name and checking every potential shelter in the neighborhood, under porches, in tool sheds, behind the dumpster, at the corner market that had somehow remained open despite the power outage. Meredith proved to be a capable search partner, pointing out hiding spots that would never have occurred to Ezra and maintaining a calm optimism that kept his panic from spiraling into despair. But as the storm intensified and the afternoon light began to fade, their search area grew smaller and more desperate. Sable could be anywhere. He could be injured, trapped, slowly freezing in some hiding place they would never think to check. "We should go back," Meredith said finally, shouting to be heard over the wind. "Wait for the storm to pass. He might come home on his own once it's calmer." They were walking back toward their street when Ezra heard it, a sound so faint it might have been his imagination, but distinct enough to stop him in his tracks. "Do you hear that?" he asked, grabbing Meredith's arm. They stood perfectly still in the swirling snow, listening. There it was again, a weak, mewing sound coming from somewhere nearby. "Under here," Meredith said, pointing toward her front porch. She dropped to her knees in the snow and peered into the dark space beneath the steps. "Sable, is that you, baby?" A pitiful meow answered her, and Ezra felt his knees go weak with relief. It took both of them to coax Sable out from his hiding place. He was soaked through and shivering violently, his fur matted with ice and snow, but his green eyes, when they finally met Ezra's, held the same steady trust they'd always carried. "Let's get him inside and warmed up," Meredith said, leading them toward her house. The next hour passed in a blur of towels and warm milk and gentle hands working to restore circulation to half-frozen paws. Sable submitted to the attention with the dignity of someone who understood that pride was a luxury he couldn't afford under the circumstances. By the time he was dry and warm, curled up near the camping stove with one of Meredith's cats, the storm outside had begun to ease. "I should take him home," Ezra said, though he made no move to leave the warmth of Meredith's kitchen. "Your house will be like an icebox without power," Meredith replied. "Why don't you both stay here tonight? I have plenty of blankets, and the camping stove keeps this room fairly warm." It was the first time in 3 years that Ezra had spent the night anywhere other than his own house. But as he lay on Meredith's sofa with Sable curled against his chest, listening to the storm finally exhaust itself against the windows, he felt something he hadn't experienced since Margaret's death: the simple comfort of not being alone with his fears. The power came back on the next morning with a sudden hum of electronics returning to life. Meredith made coffee on her restored stove, while Ezra watched Sable carefully inspect each of her cats in turn, as if cataloguing new neighbors he might encounter in the future. "Thank you," Ezra said as they prepared to leave. The words felt inadequate for what had happened. Not just the rescue, but the way Meredith had opened her home without question, the way she'd treated his panic over a cat as the serious emergency it felt like to him. "I'm glad we found him," she said simply. Then, after a pause, "You know, I've been thinking about getting together a neighborhood emergency plan, something so we can check on each other when storms like this hit. Would you be interested in helping with that?" The old Ezra would have declined politely, would have retreated back into the safety of isolation where he couldn't disappoint anyone or lose anything that mattered. But standing in Meredith's kitchen with Sable purring in his arms, Ezra found himself nodding. "I think that would be a good idea," he said. As they walked back to his house through snow that sparkled in the morning sunshine, Ezra realized that something fundamental had changed during the long night of the storm. He was no longer just a man with a cat. He was part of something larger, a network of people who looked out for each other, who showed up when needed, who understood that caring for others was not a burden, but a privilege. It was a frightening thought. It was also the most hopeful thing he'd felt in years. That evening, as Sable settled back into his favorite spot on the windowsill and began the elaborate grooming ritual that suggested he considered the previous day's adventure successfully concluded, Ezra found himself making a list of neighbors he didn't know but should. Names on mailboxes he'd seen but never connected to faces. People who lived close enough to matter in an emergency, but far enough away to maintain the privacy they probably valued as much as he did. Tomorrow, he thought, he might introduce himself to the woman with the small dog who walked past his house every morning, or the elderly man who spent every sunny day tending the garden that took up most of his front yard. Tomorrow he might take another small step toward rejoining the world he'd left behind, when grief convinced him that caring was too dangerous to attempt again. But tonight, he was content to sit in his warm house with his cat, listening to the sounds of a neighborhood settling back into its normal rhythms after the storm. The snowplow rumbled past around 8 o'clock, pushing the worst of the accumulation to the sides of the street, where it would linger in gray piles until the next thaw. Porch lights flickered on one by one as people emerged from their storm-induced hibernation, checking on property damage and reconnecting with the outside world. Sable seemed none the worse for his adventure, though he stayed closer to Ezra than usual, as if the experience had reminded him how valuable this particular warm house and reliable human had become. When Ezra moved from the kitchen to the living room, Sable followed. When he climbed the stairs to his bedroom for the first time in months, Sable padded up behind him and claimed a spot on the comforter that suggested he'd been planning this expansion of territory for some time. "I suppose you think you live here now," Ezra said, but there was no complaint in his voice. If anything, the presence of another heartbeat in the room made the prospect of sleep seem less like temporary surrender and more like peaceful rest. That night, Ezra dreamed of summer afternoons with Margaret, of her voice calling his name from the garden where she grew tomatoes and basil and flowers whose names he'd never bothered to learn. But instead of the usual bitter awakening that such dreams brought, he woke to find Sable stretched across his chest, purring with the deep contentment of a cat who had found exactly where he belonged. The emergency planning meeting happened 2 weeks later, in Meredith's living room. 7 neighbors showed up, more than Ezra had expected, fewer than Meredith had hoped for, but enough to constitute a beginning. They mapped out who had generators, who had medical training, who had 4-wheel drive vehicles that could navigate unplowed streets. They exchanged phone numbers and agreed to check on each other during severe weather warnings. Ezra spoke exactly 3 times during the meeting, each contribution brief and practical, but he stayed for the entire hour, and when Mrs. Henderson from 2 doors down mentioned that her cat had been missing for 3 days, he found himself volunteering to help search. They found Mrs. Henderson's cat, a plump orange tabby named Marmalade, trapped in the crawl space beneath the community center, apparently having squeezed through a gap in the foundation and then grown too panicked to find his way back out. It took 40 minutes of patient coaxing and a trail of treats, but eventually Marmalade emerged, dusty and indignant, but unharmed. "I don't know how to thank you," Mrs. Henderson said, clutching Marmalade to her chest with the fierce relief of someone who had prepared herself for the worst. "Just pass it on," Ezra replied, echoing something Margaret used to say whenever someone thanked her for kindnesses that seemed to come as naturally as breathing. Winter deepened, but the isolation that had defined Ezra's life for 3 years continued to thaw. He began shopping for groceries in person rather than relying on delivery, partly because Sable required specialty food that wasn't available online, partly because the brief conversations with checkout clerks and fellow shoppers had become something he looked forward to rather than dreaded. The hardware store clerk knew him by name now, and the woman at the post office always asked about "that handsome cat of yours." Small interactions, but they added up to something that felt remarkably like belonging to a community. In February, when the Methodist Church announced they were starting a pet blessing service for Valentine's Day, Meredith suggested that Ezra bring Sable. "I don't really go to church," he said, which wasn't entirely true. He and Margaret had attended regularly, until her illness made the physical act of sitting through services too difficult. After her death, the thought of returning to a place so connected to their shared life had seemed impossible. "It's not really about church," Meredith said gently. "It's about acknowledging that our pets are part of our families, that they matter." The blessing service was brief and surprisingly moving. Pastor Williams, a soft-spoken woman in her 60s, spoke about the ways animals teach humans about unconditional love, about living in the present moment, about the healing power of simple presence. She blessed each pet individually, dogs and cats, and one elderly parrot who seemed to enjoy the attention, while their owners stood nearby, many of them wiping away tears they hadn't expected to shed. When it was Sable's turn, Pastor Williams placed a gentle hand on his head and said, "Bless this cat, who brings comfort to those who need it most, and who reminds us that love often comes in unexpected forms." Ezra felt his throat tighten. Beside him, Meredith squeezed his arm in understanding. After the service, as they walked home through the late afternoon snow, Sable trotting proudly in his new harness and leash, a recent concession to safety that he'd accepted with surprising grace, Ezra found himself talking about Margaret for the first time since her funeral. "She would have loved this," he said, gesturing at Sable, who was pausing to investigate every interesting scent along their route. "She always said I needed something to take care of besides her. Something that would outlast—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but Meredith nodded as if he had. "She sounds like she was very wise." She was, about everything except how much time we had left. Ezra paused to let Sable examine a particularly fascinating patch of snow. "I thought when she died that the caring part of me died too, that I'd used up all my capacity for love and couldn't risk trying again. But apparently cats don't care what you think you can't do." He looked down at Sable, who had finished his investigation, and was looking up at both humans with the patient expression of someone waiting for the walking to resume. "They just show up and decide you're going to take care of them whether you want to or not." That night, as spring began its earliest stirrings beneath the winter snow, and Sable claimed his usual spot at the foot of the bed, Ezra realized that somewhere in the past few months, he had stopped being a man who happened to have a cat and become a man whose life was shaped by the responsibility and joy of caring for another creature. It was a terrifying thought. It was also the foundation for everything that was about to come. Spring arrived in Bangor, with the kind of sudden warmth that makes everyone remember why they choose to live in Maine, despite the brutal winters. By mid-April, the snow had melted into rushing streams that carried the detritus of winter toward the Penobscot River, and the first green shoots were pushing through the soggy earth with determined optimism. Sable spent increasingly long hours on his windowsill, watching the neighborhood come alive after months of hibernation. Children emerged from houses like flowers blooming, their voices carrying across yards that had been silent for months. Neighbors ventured out to assess winter damage and plan summer projects, calling greetings to each other across property lines that had seemed like vast distances in the frozen isolation of February. Ezra found himself drawn to these sounds of renewal. For the first time since Margaret's death, he opened windows throughout the house, letting in air that carried the scent of thawing earth and the promise of growing things. The house seemed to exhale months of held breath, and with it, some of the heavy stillness that had settled into every corner like dust. It was on one of these warm April mornings that Sable failed to appear at his usual 7 o'clock appointment. Ezra waited until 7:15, then 7:30, fighting down the familiar panic that had become his automatic response to Sable's absences. But this felt different from the December storm or the occasional day when Sable simply decided to explore other territories. This felt like goodbye. By afternoon, when there was still no sign of his cat, Ezra did something that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. He printed missing cat posters at the library. The librarian, a cheerful woman named Janet who had helped him navigate the computer and printer, looked at Sable's photo with genuine sympathy. "He's beautiful," she said. "How long has he been missing?" "Since yesterday evening," Ezra replied, realizing as he said it that this was the longest conversation he'd had with a stranger in years, and it felt surprisingly natural. "He usually comes home every morning, but you're worried," Janet finished. "Of course you are. Let me help you post some of these around the building, and I'll put one on our community board. Lots of people check that." Over the next 2 days, Ezra discovered a network of animal lovers in Bangor that he'd never known existed. The woman at the coffee shop near the library had fed several strays over the years and knew exactly which neighborhoods cats typically explored. The teenager working at the pet store spent his lunch break walking with Ezra through the downtown area, pointing out hiding spots that only someone who'd grown up with cats would notice. Mrs. Henderson from the emergency planning group organized an informal search party that included 3 of her grandchildren and a golden retriever, whose enthusiasm for the project exceeded his actual tracking abilities. Even Pastor Williams from the Methodist Church stopped by to offer support, bringing homemade cookies and the kind of gentle presence that made difficult situations feel more manageable. "He'll come back," she told Ezra, as they stood in his front yard, looking down the street where Sable had once appeared like a miracle in tabby form. Cats have a way of returning when they're ready, especially ones who found a home worth coming back to. But as the 3rd day stretched into evening with no sign of Sable, Ezra began to prepare himself for the possibility that this particular miracle had run its course. He sat in the living room, the room that Sable had insisted on claiming months ago, and tried to imagine his life without the steady rhythm of morning arrivals and evening departures, without the warm weight of a sleeping cat anchoring his nights, without the simple daily purpose that caring for another creature provided. It was a bleak prospect, but not the devastating emptiness it would have been a year ago. Sable had given him something more valuable than companionship. He had given him the ability to care again, to connect with other people in service of something that mattered to both of them. The search for Sable had introduced Ezra to neighbors he'd lived near for years without knowing, had shown him that the community he thought he'd lost when Margaret died had been there all along, waiting for him to be ready to rejoin it. That thought was interrupted by a familiar sound, scratching at the front door. Ezra's heart stopped, then resumed beating at double speed. He crossed the living room in 3 quick steps and yanked open the door to find Sable sitting on the porch, looking disheveled but uninjured, regarding Ezra with the calm expression of someone returning from a successful business trip. "Where the hell have you been?" Ezra demanded, his relief expressing itself as anger in the way that intense emotions often do. Sable walked past him into the house, tail held high, and proceeded directly to his food bowl. Only after he had eaten with his usual methodical precision did he approach Ezra, who was still standing by the open door, shaking with delayed reaction. The cat wound himself around Ezra's legs, purring with the deep satisfaction of someone who had accomplished exactly what he set out to do, then looked up with green eyes that seemed to hold a message Ezra was only beginning to understand. "You wanted me to worry about you," Ezra said slowly. "You wanted me to go looking, to ask for help." Sable's purr intensified, as if congratulating Ezra on figuring out a particularly complex puzzle. "So sneaky, manipulative," Ezra trailed off, unable to maintain his indignation in the face of such obvious satisfaction. He scooped Sable up and buried his face in the familiar fur, breathing in the scent of outdoors and adventure and the particular warmth that belonged only to this cat, who had somehow managed to save a man by allowing himself to be saved. The phone rang while they were still standing in the doorway, and Ezra answered to find Meredith on the other end. "I saw him on your porch," she said, her voice bright with relief. "Is he okay?" "He's fine, smug but fine." Ezra looked down at Sable, who had taken up residence at his feet and was grooming himself with the kind of thorough attention that suggested he had important social obligations to prepare for. I think he planned the whole thing. Cats are like that, Meredith agreed. They know exactly what we need, even when we don't know it ourselves. After hanging up, Ezra spent the next hour making phone calls to everyone who had helped search for Sable, sharing the good news and listening to the genuine happiness in their voices. Each conversation was brief, but each one reinforced the sense that he was part of something larger than his own small world of grief and careful solitude. The last call was to Pastor Williams, who listened to his update and then made an unexpected request. "The church is organizing a community dinner next month," she said. "We're hoping people will share stories about how they've found hope in unexpected places. Would you consider speaking about Sable?" The old Ezra would have declined immediately. The thought of standing in front of a group of people, talking about his personal life, about the slow process of healing that had brought him back to something resembling wholeness, would have been unthinkable. But as he looked at Sable, who was now sprawled across his lap with the confident possession of a cat who knew exactly where he belonged, Ezra found himself considering the possibility. "I'm not much of a public speaker," he said. "So you don't need to be eloquent," Pastor Williams replied. "You just need to be honest. Sometimes that's the most powerful thing of all." The community dinner was held on a warm evening in early May, when the last traces of winter had finally surrendered to spring's persistent advance. The church fellowship hall buzzed with conversation and the comfortable chaos of a potluck dinner where everyone had contributed something and no one was quite sure how it would all come together. Ezra arrived early, carrying a casserole dish that contained his first attempt at cooking for a crowd, a simple tuna noodle dish that Margaret had made countless times, but which he'd never tried to recreate until this week. Sable accompanied him in his traveling carrier, having been specifically invited as the evening's guest of honor. "You don't have to do this," Meredith had told him earlier, when his nervousness about the speaking engagement had reached near panic levels. "I know," Ezra had replied, "but I think maybe I want to." Now standing at the makeshift podium while 40-some neighbors and church members finished their dessert and settled in to listen, Ezra felt his mouth go dry and his hands begin to shake. Then Sable, released from his carrier and free to roam the fellowship hall, jumped onto the small table next to the podium and sat down, fixing the audience with the kind of steady gaze that suggested they had better pay attention because something important was about to happen. The laughter that rippled through the room was warm and affectionate, and Ezra felt some of his tension ease. "I wasn't planning to get a cat," he began, his voice steadier than he'd expected. 3 years ago, when my wife Margaret died, I pretty much decided I was done with caring about anything or anyone. It hurt too much to lose her, and I figured the safest thing was to just stop trying." He paused, looking out at faces that reflected his own experience back to him. The understanding that comes from having survived loss, the recognition of the courage it takes to risk caring again. "But cats don't really care what you've decided," he continued, and this time the laughter was knowing, the sound of people who had been chosen by cats and understood exactly what that meant. "This one just showed up one morning, came through my kitchen window like he owned the place, and decided I was going to take care of him whether I wanted to or not." Ezra talked for 10 minutes about Sable's persistence, about the gradual way that caring for another creature had led him back to caring about himself, about the neighbors who had become friends through the simple shared concern for a missing cat. He talked about the difference between the isolation that comes from being alone and the solitude that comes from choosing to be present in your own life. "I thought my world had ended when Margaret died," he said finally, and in some ways it had. "But Sable taught me that endings aren't always permanent. Sometimes they're just pauses before something new begins. Sometimes the thing that saves you is the thing that shows up uninvited and refuses to leave until you figure out that you don't want it to go." The applause was gentle rather than thunderous, but it carried the weight of recognition, of stories shared and understood. After the formal program ended, people lingered to talk, to share their own experiences with unexpected sources of hope, to pet Sable, who accepted the attention with his usual dignified grace. Mrs. Henderson told Ezra about the way her late husband's garden had taught her that some things grow better after they've been cut back. A young father talked about how his daughter's fearless curiosity had shown him how to see wonder in ordinary things again. An elderly man whose wife was battling Alzheimer's described the way their old dog seemed to know exactly when she needed comfort, appearing at her side with the kind of timing that felt like grace. By the time Ezra and Sable made their way home, the spring evening had settled into the kind of peaceful darkness that made everything feel possible. They walked slowly, Sable trotting beside him on his leash, both of them content to take their time returning to a house that no longer felt like a retreat from the world, but like a home base from which to engage with it. As they turned onto their street, Ezra could see lights glowing in windows up and down the block, evidence of lives being lived, of people settling in for the night with the knowledge that they were part of something larger than themselves. His own house waited at the end of the walk, porch light burning in welcome, windows open to let in the sound of spring. 6 months ago, the sight would have filled him with the familiar weight of solitude. Now it looked like exactly what it was: home. That night, as Sable claimed his usual spot at the foot of the bed and began his evening grooming ritual, Ezra reflected on the strange mathematics of rescue, how saving something often meant allowing yourself to be saved in return, how the smallest acts of care could expand into networks of connection that transformed entire neighborhoods, entire lives. Outside his window, Bangor settled into sleep with the sounds of a community at peace with itself, the distant hum of traffic on streets that led to other towns and other possibilities, the soft conversations of neighbors enjoying their front porches in the warm evening air, the rustle of new leaves on trees that had survived another winter and were ready to grow again. And inside this house that had once been a mausoleum, a man and his cat prepared for sleep with the kind of quiet contentment that comes from knowing exactly where they belong. Tomorrow would bring its own small challenges and opportunities, a neighbor who might need help, a conversation that might lead somewhere unexpected, a moment of grace disguised as ordinary Tuesday morning routine. But tonight, there was just this: the weight of a sleeping cat, the sound of spring rain beginning to fall, and the simple miracle of a heart that had learned to beat again for something other than mere survival. It wasn't much, perhaps, by the world's standards, but for a man who had thought his capacity for love had died with his wife, and a cat who had somehow known better, it was everything. The window was open, as it would remain from now on. Not because either of them needed to escape, but because the best things in life, love, hope, second chances, usually arrive uninvited, and it's important to be ready when they do. Because sometimes salvation comes on 4 paws, through an unlocked window, carrying the patience to wait while you remember who you used to be, and the faith that you can become someone even better. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it stays long enough to remind you that the world is full of people worth caring about, and you are one of them. The end. In a world that can feel increasingly disconnected, the simplest acts of love, caring for a stray cat, checking on a neighbor, opening your door when someone needs help, create ripples that extend far beyond what we can see. Sometimes the thing that saves us is the thing that needs saving too. And sometimes the most profound transformations begin not with grand gestures, but with the quiet decision to let something unexpected into our lives and to trust that caring is always worth the risk.